here tonight with Luther Weeks, and we're going to talk about voting and elections. I guess I'll just start, and I know you've been here before, but just in case people have missed it, to talk a little about your organization, Connecticut Voters Count, and what its history and its purposes.
Well, yeah, Connecticut Voters Count is really to represent the voter and the voter's interest in voting integrity, so that everyone's vote counts. It counts accurately, and it counts exactly once. And one of the things we do is I also lead a coalition that observes the post-election audits in Connecticut, where 10% of the districts in Connecticut in an election, we hand count 3 of the races and see how well the machines did in counting accurately.
And now there were elections last week in a couple of municipalities.
Yeah.
They get audited as well?
They'll get audited as well. 10% of however many districts is 2 districts. So it's a very small audit. We probably won't make any public report unless something particularly astounding happens in that. But when we have presidential primaries and August or September primaries and the general elections in November, we do make a formal report of what we observed.
Now, last November, 2012, was a pretty big election. And there was an audit. So what did you find?
Well, there's 2 interesting things. And by the way, the background, this was, I think, the 11th audit we've done. I could be wrong. And every time we do a report, we've reported that they aren't conducted very well. And a lot of times they report that the numbers don't add up, don't match between the machine and the hand count. But those are always ignored by the Secretary of State, saying that that's always a hand counting error. So, you know, the problem is if you say any difference is a hand counting error, if the machines screw up, then you would never know it. But we had 2 interesting things. They put all the districts in an election in a bucket, and they select them randomly who gets audited. And in the past elections, for the last 3 years, we found almost in every audit, we've stumbled across 1 or 2 little errors in the list of districts. This time when they did it, we found there were huge errors in the districts in the bucket. They didn't match up to the towns. There were districts that didn't exist. There were extra districts. There were districts missing. And we went through and we analyzed every town. And every place where we could research it, we pretty much found that about 50% of the ones we researched and were suspicious on had errors. And there were a bunch of others that looked suspicious and we couldn't research, and we called like 8 towns with the worst 8 errors on the list. Every single one of those was wrong. So if you're doing a random audit, let's say you're doing an IRS audit, and we don't put some of the names into the list of people we might audit their tax returns, you know, maybe will turn out that those people actually had errors and somebody got their name out of the bucket. So you can't have a random audit unless everybody's in there for selection. The other thing we found is
really surprising, actually, that they wouldn't have an accurate list and have them all in there.
Right. Yeah, it is astounding. The other thing that happened is in one of the towns, they came out with 150 less ballots than they had recorded in the election. And they figured it out, though. What they did is,
what happened?
The moderator in the polling place had read those ballots into the election machine twice because they misunderstood how the write-in ballots were counted. Okay.
Well, this is sounding very familiar.
Right. So the same thing happened in
London, yes.
And you had an election reversed on that a couple of years ago. Now,
yeah,
that's not what happened here. But you know what? People are supposed to. The election officials are supposed to check that the number of ballots matches the number of people signed in. And there's reasons that might be off by, you know, 1 or 2 or 3, but not 151 votes in a relatively small polling place. they should catch that. And if they had, then they should have done what's known as a recanvass, and they would have recounted and counted the
Right.
paper, and they would have reported the right number. So we don't know how prevalent that is in Connecticut. All we know is when we recounted Bridgeport in 2010, there was a lot of discrepancies between the number of ballots and the number of voters that checked in both directions in different polling places. But here, you know, because we had the audit, we caught that. And maybe at least that town will take a lesson from that. And there's 2 or 3 ways they could have caught that. I mean, people make errors after a 19-hour day, so I have nothing wrong with the person that made the error in the first place, but they never checked those numbers to see if they balanced. The registrars never checked. Nobody ever checked to see if those numbers balanced. To me, that was a good reason we had the audit. Maybe we'll have other towns learn from that and try to avoid being caught in that same way, or, you know. And to the credit of this town, they found out what the problem was. They recognized the problem and figured out what it was from the audit.
I think in New London, there was a recanvass only because it was so close, and I don't know if it ever would have been found had there not had to be a mandatory recanvass of that particular referendum question. There were like a 13-vote discrepancy, but the number of ballots, even on election night, I knew people who were observing the count of the absentee ballots, and one person came up to me and said, I don't know where those extra 50 ballots came from because the numbers didn't match. And that's what happened. There were about 50 or 60 ballots that were counted twice. So so we know it's happened at least twice.
Sure. I would bet it's happened more often than that, because one of these was caught in an audit, and people paid attention in the audit to research it, and the other one was caught because it was a close election. It might happen quite often where it's not caught, even in close elections.
Wow. So other than those 2 issues, were there any things that just jumped out at you after the 2012 elections?
No, the normal thing, the miscounts by machine or people, we don't know which, that were kind of ignored. But those were the 2 things that jumped out mostly.
Now, this year there's a lot going on at the Connecticut legislature. We know that it's a long session, so they do take up more bills, but it seems as though there are a lot of bills out there that are talking about different aspects of voting. So, you know, a good reason for you to be here tonight is to talk about these things, you know, what their goal is and what the prognosis is, and kind of evaluate what might make our voting better and what might actually make it worse. So I guess maybe we can start with voting by the military. That seems to be something that I suspect some kind of action will be taken.
Yeah, and we have actually 3 bills that have to do with military voting. And one of them is called the Uniform Move Act. And that's an act written by a group that tries to get every state to pass the same laws. Not a group like ALEC, which has gotten some probably well-deserved bad publicity.
But this is more like election uniformity of procedures.
It's another group that does all sorts of uniform laws. And what they had come out with is a bill to have military ballots available online 45 days before an election, and some other details. And it's mostly making the same thing available for state or local elections that we have for November elections. Now, we've come a long way in our November federal elections. The military vote at practically the same level as ordinary citizens do, if you look at the demographics by age. But there are some problems where people want to vote, they send out absentee ballots to them, and they don't get to them, or they don't get back in time. And supposed to be that every state is supposed to have ballots available online 45 days ahead of time. You should be able to download those, download an absentee ballot application, put them both in the same envelope, and send them in. So you only have one mailing in 45 days to do that. States could do better at that. They did a lot better in November 2012 than they did ever in the past. Supposedly, Connecticut, though, had some real problems with only 45% return rate. This is people requesting, you request an absentee ballot, but only 40% or so of those come back. Now, there's some question about whether that data is right, but other states get in the 80%, 90% level without doing electronic voting or anything like that. And some states allow email and fax return of ballots. Rhode Island, for instance, came and testified to Connecticut, and they got 3% of their ballots returned that way from the military. So if we were as successful as Rhode Island's been after, I don't know, 13 years of doing this, we'd be up to 43%.
So really, that didn't help the turnout very much among the overseas military.
Right, it doesn't help much. People hold up the Secretary of State of West Virginia as an example. She did a prototype a couple of years ago. They got, I don't know, 70 votes in, $1,000 a ballot to get, and to their credit, the West Virginia legislature has decided not to continue that prototype. But that's used as an example a lot of times. So we have that bill. It passed the legislature last year unanimously in both houses, and the governor, to his credit, vetoed the bill. And the Secretary of State is against it as well. There's a lot that Connecticut can do.
And part of it is just being able to get the ballots to the people overseas in a timely manner.
That's the hard part, because they move around a lot, so it's getting it to them. Now, coming back in a federal election, there's a free express mail return available that statistically they've checked. Most of them are back in 5 days. They're almost all back in 7 days. So that's a pretty good thing. Connecticut could pay for a return from overseas.
Sure.
I think it's about $80 at the highest level of cost worldwide. That's a lot cheaper than $1,000, and it works a lot easier than email and fax. I trust that a lot more.
Well, yeah, and then you could verify the envelope that it really came from the right person.
That's right. And if I vote it and I stick it in an envelope and mail it, then I have some confidence that my commanding officer didn't look at it, or somebody else, or my sergeant didn't look at it as it goes between me and the fax machine. And where does it go after it's faxed? Does it get shredded, or what happens to it?
The fax idea seems really odd to me, because every time I fax to any bigger office, you never really know who's going to get it, or whether it will get to the right
People
place
in town hall can
or
see
the wrong
it.
place.
Yeah, and in the Connecticut's bill, they wisely say that you have to sign away your right to a secret vote, which is in our Constitution. But what they don't understand is it's not the soldier's right to a secret vote. It's all of our right that nobody sees any of our votes. You vote in secret so you can't sell it. Just also so nobody will know how you did vote. But you also want everybody's vote to be secret, so they can't sell it.
So are there any pitfalls to making the ballots available online to be sent back, through this express mail?
Well, it's letting people know that there's express mail there. They blame a lot of the states for this, but the military has a role to play. The military, they have a hard job to do, but on the other hand, they're supposed to have a voting assistance officer available to every soldier. Well, that voting assistance officer is supposed to have a sign on the wall and know about express mail return, but nobody in our legislature, none of the military there knew about that, apparently. I'm the only one in the state that knows about this. And that same assistance officer that's supposed to know about that, that's the person that's supposed to get you the fax access and get you the email access on your military computer. Pretty strange things here we're expected
Yeah.
to believe.
Of these 40% that came back from
Yeah.
the military, did any of them come back in the express mail envelopes, or is there
That
no
I
way to
can't-
know?
That I can't tell you. Okay.
Yeah, so what we need to do for the military overseas is to help them get their ballots.
And follow the procedures of other states. Provide them more information. So maybe the state, when they're getting their ballot, tells them there's this free express mail. If the military doesn't do the job, then we can do the job.
Yeah, just put it on the ballot instructions.
Right. Put it in instructions. Put a big flag on there.
Okay, so is there anything, anything else that's up that's in the legislature this year related to military voting, or did that?
That's it.
Cover it.
There's three. There's that uniform overseas vote.
Yeah.
There's two that have to do with the military email and fax voting.
Does it look like the email and fax are going to go through?
My only assumption is that since it's passed last year unanimously, and almost the same kind of bill passed the year before that way, it's going to pass this year, and hopefully the governor will veto it again, just like he did last year for good reason. One of the problems, though, is we get bills put together. So it was put together with another bill last year. That bill went down with it also. They might put it in some bill the governor really wants to pass, and he might have a tougher time. You know.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting to me that people who are more computer savvy tend to be much more cautious in this case. And that isn't true of most uses of technology, but in terms of voting, it seems as though the less savvy you are, the more you think it might be a good idea to vote online.
Yeah, because you are lured into believing, like, for instance, online banking, it only works because the banks pay billions of dollars every year to take care of the fraud that occurs, because the billions of dollars that they lose is less than what they save by doing online banking. We read about the military being hacked, China hacking the U.S. military. Now the U.S. government's trying to hack China back. We had this story, ATMs. Last week they had a story, 2,900 ATMs were hacked in New York City last week, and they stole $2.9 million.
Wow.
But that was worldwide. It was 45 million worldwide in a couple of days. Now they caught them, but if it was voting, you'd have a hard time even knowing that it happened.
Yeah, and it could have a huge effect on elections. And when Connecticut chose what kind of hardware to replace the lever machines with, wisely, the state decided not to go with touchscreens, but they wanted a paper ballot. And this seems to eliminate the spirit of that whole thing, of having a paper backup that you can check.
You can't audit an online election. You get a piece of paper when you go to the ATM, and you got an account to balance that with. Somebody's going to lose money if something goes wrong, and somebody's going to have to pay for it. You can't get a receipt for your ballot. Once again, the secret ballot.
Now, I know that early voting, in addition to internet voting and mail-in voting, have been in the news partly because during some popular, big elections, people end up standing in line for a long time. So what's your take on all of these different alternatives to try to keep people from being too inconvenienced by standing in line?
First of all, people standing in line for a long time is a matter of having enough check-in lines in Connecticut. All except for maybe a handful of polling places, one of our voting machines is more than sufficient to handle all the voters in that district, even if they all show up at 100% turnout. There's a small number of districts that maybe you ought to have 2 or 3 machines because they've got, like in the order of 6,000, 8,000 voters, so that might be close to the capacity. So, there were 2 causes of lines last year in Connecticut. None of them were our voting machines. Most of the problems were very publicized, but it was they didn't have enough lines of people checking things in, And the officials just didn't handle that right. They should have easily been able to expand that and handle it, because the machines can handle it. The other problem was something called the presidential ballot, which is actually not going to exist in Connecticut. We've got, unfortunately, we've got even a slower thing called Election Day registration coming up. And Election Day registration starts this year. And I would recommend to your viewers, forget that Election Day registration exists. Register to vote in a normal way, because you may end up with a very long line at Election Day registration. And if you're there at 8 o'clock in line, they're going to cut the line off. They won't even let you vote. So
if you intend to vote, register ahead of time.
Register ahead of time. I mean, if there's some dire emergency or whatever, try Election Day registration. But it's not like it is in other states. We're doing it a very hard, slow way in Connecticut. So just it's good that we got Election Day registration, but I wish it wasn't the way that we have it. So there's basically 2 or 3 types of early voting. You have mail-in early voting, which in Connecticut we call unlimited absentee voting. And it may be different. There's states that have only mail-in voting, like Oregon.
Yes.
And
my in-laws love it.
Yeah, and maybe kind of worse than that even is a state like Colorado, and some places in California, where they have voting just like we have, but then they mail everybody a ballot. And so they got all these ballots floating around out there, and some people are planning on going to the polling place. They don't even know whether they got a ballot or not. And then we have in-person early voting. And there's really 2 types of that. And one type is what I would call, it's real polling, it's real voting like your polling place. You go and you get a ballot and you would feed it into an optical scanner.
Right, and you're checked off the master list, so
checked
they
off the
know
master list and all that stuff. We've got some proposals for early voting in Connecticut, and what I would characterize them as in-person absentee voting. So you go in person, you get a ballot,
right,
and you put it in an envelope and you vote it, but it doesn't go through the machine right away while you're there. So early voting is kind of a compromise. That in-person early voting, either way, is safer than absentee voting and unlimited absentee voting or mail-in voting, in my opinion. So we have 3 bills before the legislature this year. Now, one is a constitutional amendment, and the Attorney General ruled a couple of years ago that the legislature doesn't have a power to do any kind of early voting. They got to change our Constitution so that the legislature can do any of these things: absentee voting, all mail-in voting, early in-person voting, or whatever. So they have to change the Constitution to allow that. Suddenly, this year, some people said, well, that's not necessary anymore. And so we have a bill in there to mandate early voting in at least one polling place in each municipality in the state for, I believe it's 8 days before an election. It might have been, and maybe it's 5 days out of 8. It's been a while since I've read it. And now we have another bill for early voting that would allow municipalities, up to 9 municipalities, 3 small, medium, 3 large, to try it in the upcoming November election, municipal election. And that may be constitutional because it only applies to municipal elections, and but that's in debate. And it's not unfair, since we're having municipal elections, if you have it in specific municipalities, you're not being unfair to letting some voters in some towns do it and not in others when they're voting for the same candidates. I think what's interesting about that is it's being pushed by the city of New Haven. A lot of legislators in New Haven want it. Unlike the other ones, it doesn't put any requirements, like you got to have 5 days of voting and all that. All you have to have is at least 1 day. So it would be less expensive. But look at New Haven. Okay, this is the first time in 20 years you have a competitive race in New Haven for the mayor.
Yeah.
So you're guaranteed to have turnout to go up, whether you do early voting or not. Now, early voting...
Now, would the early voting also potentially apply to a primary election, which might also be pretty heated?
No, not this year. This is this prototype that allows this, pilot, rather.
Yeah.
But first of all, early voting has been proven to decrease turnout. Decrease, not increase, decrease turnout. Most people think it increases turnout, it decreases turnout.
Huh.
But, of course, if you want to sell early voting or any other election thing, you say it will increase turnout. That's like the holy grail of voting.
Yeah.
So, but New Haven, I'm guaranteeing you right now, will have higher turnout this November, whether that bill passes or not, because you got the first competitive election in 20 years. They've only had Mayor DeStefano, who was apparently very popular there, who's not running again. So, I think even in the general election, it'll be more exciting than in the past, and more voters, no matter what they do.
Yeah, a couple years ago when New London voted for its first mayor since the 20s or 30s, we had fantastic turnout because, you got to, your vote really meant something for change.
Yeah.
So, so we'll see what happens in New Haven. Is that pilot going to pass, do you think?
I really don't know.
Yeah.
A lot of bills get proposed, some good, some not so good, and very few pass.
Now, you mentioned that early voting, although it's purported to increase turnout, doesn't really. I had read somewhere that it also doesn't really decrease lines on election day very well.
Well, it depends on, it depends on how you spread out your resources. Now, if you say you're going to have the same number of people on election day in every polling place, and you're going to have early voting, all things being equal, then sure, it's going to go faster on election day because you have less people there. Florida in the last election was a big exception, but there's a lot of things, it's not worth talking about that. But if you say, well, we're having early voting, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. In a very little town in Connecticut with only one polling place, if I got to stay open 7 days, I just multiply my election day cost by almost a factor of 7.
Yeah.
Okay, my town, Glastonbury, it's probably going to double our costs. Hartford or New Haven, if they only have one polling place for early voting, then it really isn't increasing their cost that much because they got 20, 30 polling places. But if you say, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to spend 7 times as much or double, let me cut down what I'm doing on election day. People said we did it if we had a storm. If we only had early voting, we wouldn't have these problems 2 years ago in November because of the storm. Well, wait a minute. My understanding is the storm hit when you would have been doing early voting, so you would have had more people on election. If you had less resources on election day, you wouldn't have changed anything. They wouldn't have done early voting. They would have waited till election day. On the other hand, what if you have a storm on election day? Does that mean you would have had would you have predicted that? And would people have actually voted early because of this predicted storm? Then would you have expanded your early voting because you predicted more people would come out? So it's a very, I'm not against in-person early voting. You just got to understand it's a convenience for the voters, and it's going to probably lower turnout. But if you're willing to pay for it and willing to secure those ballots in a good way, which is a challenge, I'm nothing against it. Now, the trouble with absentee voting, unlimited absentee voting, is it's not only convenience for voters, it's a convenience for those that would do fraud or would like to coerce or sell their votes.
Well, we're going to take a break for our community calendar. I think it's about 4 minutes. We'll take questions when we get back, and we'll talk about more of what Connecticut is up to on the voting front.
Okay, we didn't talk about the Oh, yeah, sorry.
Dance with me, Rosalita.
Allowing voters to be
You know when I loved you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. You know if you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. Thoughts of you still conjure, breezes blowing through my long red hair. You know it's not so wonder back to that easy life we led back there. Dance with me, Rosalita. You know when I love you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. You know if you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. Dance with me, Rosalita. You know when I loved you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. You know if you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. But sometimes I still wonder when I hear one of those old refrains. Whatever became of you, and if any of your love for me remains, dance with me, Rosalita. You know when I loved you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. If only you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. We could bring it all back tonight. We could bring it all back tonight.
posted.
Welcome back to Thinking Green. I'm here with Luther Weeks, and we're talking voting. Well, one of the bills that got a thumbs up was something about not allowing people who are felons to be registrars.
No, that's not exactly
Well,
right.
okay.
To be moderator.
What? Oh, to be
No, I'm a a certified moderator. And that means I passed the test so I can run a polling place or run absentee vote counting, which is what I've done in the past. And so I have to pass the test to do that.
Right.
And then the Secretary of State certifies me and gives me the certificate, and then I can do that. So one of the things in the new law is they've proposed a law that a felon could not be certified. So the Secretary has to check before she gives that certification out to make sure I'm not a felon. And I've just got to stay on the straight and narrow if I want to continue to be an election moderator. But the fun thing about this bill to me, though, is I would work for the Registrar of Voters in an election, and the registrars are not only not required to be certified, they can be felons and run for Registrar of Voters like the Secretary of State can. Neither of them have to be certified. The only office in the state you have to be anything is Attorney General. You have to be a lawyer.
And you have to have practiced, right?
Yeah, you have to have practiced, right? And then they even removed that requirement. You know, people would think the controller maybe ought to be an accountant, and maybe the treasurer ought to have an MBA or something. But there's no requirements.
Felons.
Right. There's no requirements. You know, even to be Secretary of State, you don't even have to have voted in an election and know how to fill out a ballot. But rest assured, when you come to my polling place, the Secretary is going to make sure that I'm not a felon.
Yeah, I would hope not.
If that passes.
Now, there are a couple other things that are being considered that we didn't talk about. And one thing about cross endorsements, and people who are in New London know that sometimes we've had some cross endorsements. When I ran for Board of Education in 2009, I was cross endorsed by the local Republicans. The Democrats in New London don't cross endorse because they just are, they can find enough candidates, I guess.
Okay.
But now there have been some movement in the legislature to maybe make cross endorsements not legal.
That's correct.
Now, what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, I can't tell you. I've heard some rumors of what the reasoning were, but they're completely illogical. But when we had testimony on that bill, every person testifying on the bill was against eliminating cross endorsements. Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Miles Rappaport, all sorts of people, independent parties, Working Families Party. And some of the legislators on the committee testified to how great it was that they got cross-endorsed and how they appreciated that in their elections. And one of them in particular said that, you know, this was a solution searching for a problem. After doing that, they went and all voted for the bill. To his credit, only one Democrat, Senator Meyer, voted against it. You know, so I think the public would certainly not appreciate that.
Well, we have a phone call. Thanks for calling Thinking Green.
Hey, Rona, and your guest is Dennis from New London.
Yeah.
Rona, great show. You know, I've been hearing a lot about this voting stuff, different ways that they're talking, and I have some questions about it, and I wasn't sure who to ask, and voila.
Maybe Luther's the guy.
So I got 4 quick questions, if I may. He was talking about early voting. How early are you talking about?
Well, the bills before the legislature for this in-person early voting, I think it was started about 8 days before the election.
Okay.
So it's not like a long time. It's a moderate amount of time.
Now, is there more chance of voter fraud when you're talking early voting?
I don't believe that there's any particular chance of more in-person early voting. There's not a increase in voter fraud as far as I know, or any way for that. You got to be more careful of custody of the ballots and custody of the information, which might indicate what votes are until after the polls close on Election Day. But there's no particular increase in fraud that anyone that I know of has suggested with that.
See, I didn't realize that the early voting thing meant actually physically going and voting early. I thought it was something you did either on the phone or mail-in or something like that.
Well, there is mail-in voting. That's a different thing, and that's one where I'm concerned. That's where all the fraud occurs today, pretty much in elections. There's regular fraud in Connecticut and other states by a mail-in.
Do you think that if they had voting on Saturdays when most people are off work, that would increase the amount of turnout you would have?
You know, if it was an early voting day, if it was an extra day, yes. I'd like to see it.
You do it on a Saturday.
Yeah, I'd like to see, though, but I think you need it during the week as well, because people go away on weekends. So, you know, all of us concerned about elections are going to change our plans and be here to vote. But I'd like to see, you know, Election Day be a holiday, but I'd like to see a Wednesday, as far away from the weekend as possible, and maybe a half a holiday. You get half a day off.
I'd go along with that.
Yeah.
And one more. How do you feel about all the talk about IDs for voting?
Yeah, I think that Connecticut has very reasonable ID requirements. Some states are very lax. Some states have been trying to put in very stringent, very suppressive voter ID requirements. Very, very, very few instances of voter fraud where voter ID would have any effect on that. There is one good little bill before the General Assembly this year. I hope it passes. I think it will. And that is they have to post the voter ID requirements in every polling place, because there's a lot of confusion. Voters arrive and have the wrong impression, but we actually have election officials with the wrong ideas sometimes, and leave the wrong impression. So if it's right up on their wall, if an official does something wrong, the voter can go read it right there and read them the law if they have to.
And thanks for calling. We actually have another caller.
Okay, I want to thank you very much. You gave me some good answers.
Oh,
Okay,
thank you,
thanks
Dennis.
for calling in,
All right,
Dennis.
bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for calling.
Hi.
Hi.
I've watched Luther testify before in Hartford a number of times. It's good talking. A couple things, Luther. One of the things that you mentioned was the presidential ballots.
Yes.
They are still going to have presidential ballots. It's basically a federal thing.
No,
And
so
people who have moved out of the state recently and who couldn't get to register in their own state, they could come back to Connecticut or to their town and vote within a time. This is the 30-day limit or something. It's still part of that presidential ballot bill that the federal government requires.
well, there's a whole bunch of ballots and a whole bunch of different ballots, a lot more than, you know, we can always remember. But when I'm referring to a presidential ballot, it's a Connecticut thing, where any resident of Connecticut can actually go to town hall if they're not registered.
On the day of, right?
On the day of, and they can prove that they, you know, essentially could register, and they're given a ballot, and they only get to vote for president. And
Right.
that's being eliminated because we have Election Day registration starting this November, so that you don't need a presidential ballot, because the one that I'm referring to, because those people can go to town hall now or wherever it's designated in town and vote the whole election for whatever district they should have been registered in.
So they would just be handed the same ballot as everyone
They'd be
else.
handed the same ballot, and they'd be registered to vote all in one shot. Now, there are other special situations, especially overseas voters and the like, who are not, you know, that really are sort of registered in the place where they last resided in the U.S.
Well, what you said, I understand, but again, the presidential ballot is still valid. There are a few people still that will come on a presidential day only that are allowed to go and vote for the president and vice president if they've moved out of the town recently for a short period of time and can come back in because they couldn't register in another state. That is still allowed. The other thing, the constitutional question will be on the ballot in November of 2004 on the unexcused absentee voting, and also whether they can allow voting other days than election day under the same course.
The early voting, there's a bill to change the Constitution to allow the legislature to implement whatever forms of early voting they'd like to. To pass the constitutional amendment, you have to get, I think it's 3/4 of the legislature to vote for it, or 2/3. If not, you have to get two legislatures in a row to vote over 50% for it. This is that second year. This year it'll probably pass. Then you have a referendum in 2014, and then you can start early voting sometime after 2014, presuming the referendum passes and the Constitution changes. Not really a referendum, it's a question on the ballot.
So will we expect to see that?
That passed both houses of the Connecticut legislature. The Senate just recently passed it, so after the House passed it.
Right.
It will be on the ballot in 2014.
Well, the governor does have to sign it, but I certainly believe he will.
Right. And the other thing, well, you've had some great talks. I'm going to get off and let you finish up with that. I just wanted to point out those two things I heard you talking about.
Okay, thanks for calling. Now, there are a couple other voting issues that might not be coming up this year. Well, actually, there's one more that I wanted to mention, the campaign finance disclosure. What's the proposed change in legislation?
The idea on this is, as I understand it, and it's a complex bill, and this is an area I don't spend too much time on, but the idea in the face of Citizens United, where all sorts of groups can spend all sorts of money on all sorts of issues, is that to list the top funders on an ad. So it isn't citizens who love fracking, bill, or the Citizens Against Fracking, but the bill is for fracking. It has to list the top X many donors on the ad, so that the public can have a better judgment of who's behind these things. So there's other disclosure provisions in it. So, if we can't prevent people from spending unlimited amounts of money, at least let's know who those people are, and not these funny names that sound so nice.
Yep, and I got the thumbs up, and from me too. Now, we have a little bit of time to talk about just general voting issues, and national popular vote is something that you hear all the time, and after some very close elections and some elections in which the Electoral College tallies did not very well necessarily reflect the national vote, it comes back all the time, the idea of a national popular vote. So what's your take on the national popular vote?
Yeah, so in theory, I'm in favor of the idea. But, like DDT and nuclear power, even though they have some really great benefits, there's some consequences that we don't like to have. And the current national popular vote bill has some largely unanticipated consequences. And what we're trying to do is we got a federal system built around the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is actually broken. But the national popular vote bill put on top of that makes it worse. We don't have one person, one vote in this country. Every state has different franchises. Some enfranchise felons. Some have all sorts of early voting and have higher turnout that way. Some have voter suppression. And to have every vote count equally, we need national uniform laws, like a right to vote, for example.
You think that would be uncontroversial?
You would think it would be, but and what we saw in Florida in 2000 is an example of the current broken system. If those ballots had been recounted in a rational way all across Florida, most people believe Al Gore would actually have won under the Electoral College. But, part of what the Supreme Court ruled is that Florida wasn't even uniform in the way it recounted ballots. But the other thing is, we got a law that says by a certain date in December, you've got to certify the election in every single state in the country where those states' votes won't count. So into this national popular vote scheme, there's no official number for a state to choose who to cast their electoral votes for. We don't even know if Al Gore won in 2000. Supposedly, he won the national popular vote, but that's an unaudited number. We don't know, how close that election really was.
And of course, you mentioned different standards too, because we don't know what kind of voter suppression was involved there or anyplace else.
Right, and what you saw in some swing states now, you'd see in every state, because stealing adding Republican votes in Connecticut helps under the national popular vote. Adding Democratic votes in Oklahoma helps. So everything's on the table. So you have to have a uniform, trusted voting system to switch to a national popular vote.
Well, we have about 1 minute left. What can individuals do to support good voting or to support your organization?
Well, first of all, I recommend reading ConnecticutVotersCount.org. And we put news up there almost every week, 1 or 2 articles on what's going on and issues like that. Be concerned about voting integrity. Half the people I talk to throw their hands up and say it's impossible to have it, and the other half say, "You worried about our elections?" So they trust their election officials, even though they don't trust their congressmen, and maybe they've seen the police get in trouble and their mayor get in trouble and their governor, but they somehow trust all the election officials to do it right every time. So take a look and then become an election official. Call your registrar of voters and say you want to work the polls on election day and serve the voters.
Well, it sounds like good ideas, and we'll have you back, I'm sure, after the elections in November to see how things went. Thanks, Luther, for coming on. And
thank you.
Go to ConnecticutVotersCount.org because there is a huge amount of information there. So thanks again, and we'll see you in November.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.